Okay, now we're going to be taking a look at the ways we can create God rays within the clouds and the different effects and settings that will change the intensity of our God rays and their overall quality. So the first thing I want to do is just go to the atmosphere editor, and we're just using the default sky. That'll be good enough to demonstrate all of these different features. And we're just going to add a cloud layer, and we can add any of the clouds, of course, and we can edit them to fit with God rays. But we're going to select the ones that come with view, the spectral, and we're going to select thick cumulus and click OK. And now we can see we have some really nice looking clouds in the sky. But what we want to do is reduce that ambient lighting just a little. And currently right now we have no shadow density. One of the important things about God rays is you need shadows. So if we click God rays, we're not going to see any changes at all. If we go to our Cloud tab, we're going to right mouse click and go to Edit Material. And under our Lighting Effects tab, we have Internal Shadows and Cast Shadows. If I turn off Internal Shadows, we end up with a very, very flat sky, very similar to just the simple or standard model and the volumetric model, besides just the spectral model. And we can also turn on Cast Shadows. Now, right now, we still have internal shadows turned off, but we have a very flat layer, and we can actually create some interesting looking clouds that way, if that's what you're looking for. We can also change this volumetric layer to a flat layer, and that way we just have very, very simple clouds, nothing volumetric about it, you can't really fly through that. But if that's the kind of sky that you're looking for, then you can just change these settings and get that different type of effect. So I'm going to turn on internal shadows and cast shadows, and now we can actually see some of these God rays starting to come in. I'm going to go ahead and turn the sun and turn the camera towards the sun so that we can see a little bit better the effects that are actually being created. And we can see that we have all these rays coming in that weren't there before. And if I go back into our material and turn off cast shadows, we can see those disappear completely, and we don't have any God rays. So I'm going to turn that back on. And now we can also adjust the intensity of that by adjusting a couple of other different settings. We can adjust our shadow density to give the appearance that that's a little bit brighter, because by decreasing the shadow density on the ground, we end up with a brighter rays in our sky. But what we can also do is go to the Sky, Fog, and Haze tab and adjust our aerial perspective. If I turn this down to 1, we can see that most of our God rays end up disappearing. So our God rays are linked almost directly to our aerial perspective, which can sometimes throw off your scene if you're higher up in the air and maybe you don't want the effects that aerial perspective will give you, but you still want God rays. So there are other things you can do to compensate for that. We can increase our glow intensity, which will brighten up our sky, and if we increase our scattering, that'll help that a little. But it also, we can see the different changes in our rays because of that. So I'm just going to increase that just a tiny little bit, decrease our glow, and I'm going to click OK. And I want to do just a quick render of this so we can see what it looks like. Just a final render. It'll be a little bit grainy, but that's okay. Click OK, and we'll just go ahead and render that. And now we can see, although we have some very grainy clouds, we can see our God rays coming in through our clouds. And we have our sun back here shining through. So if we adjust our clouds and move them, one really neat thing you can do is just turn on those animated effects that are available. And if we go to the atmosphere editor, I'll just close that out. And going to our cloud layer and using the direction, velocity, and rate of change, we can have our God rays changing to match our clouds and just get some really, really neat effects out of that. And actually, God rays is not directly linked to volumetric sunlight, one thing that you'll notice. Another thing is we can also adjust our quality boost, which will have a lot to do with our God rays and how those are going to look, because that is also linked to our aerial perspective. Volumetric sunlight enables us to actually use the volumetric settings on our sun. So it's sort of another way of just turning that on, even though we could just simply check that on and off without actually using the settings within the atmosphere editor. Click OK, and that's still checked, so to turn that off. So we could edit other things with our volumetric sunlight, adding maybe a mist within the rays and things like that. So there's a lot we can do with those different settings. God rays also work with our meta clouds. I'm going to click OK. And we're going to add a meta cloud, which is right mouse click. And we can load one of the preset clouds that are already in here. And keep in mind, these are just basic shapes. When you create a meta cloud, even if we create the same one several times in a row, they will end up being different. So this is more of our base shape and the type of cloud that we would like. And you can see right here, it tells us how many spheres it's going to be creating to make our cloud. Between 5 and 10 for this one, we have 92 to 188. This one in here is 320. But those variations on those ones are because it can be a little bit random. It's not necessarily exactly what's being shown. So what we can do is just add one of these cumulonimbus clouds. And we can see that the actual cloud right now, it doesn't really match the clouds in our scene. But when we position this up in the sky a little bit more, it'll start to take more of that color. Plus, we can also edit the settings of our meta cloud to match our scene. And that way we can have a little more control over what sort of clouds are in our scene and not just what's being controlled in the function editor. We can create some custom clouds. And I'm just going to send that back a little. And we can see that way back in the sky. But the more it goes back, we can see it's sort of inside of that God ray that's coming down. We have some lighter areas and some darker areas, and it starts to match up just a little bit more as it gets in there. We can also scale this if we wanted to make it a little bit brighter or a little bit larger. And now we're going to double click on our meta cloud up in the upper right here to pull up our material editor. And we can see that we have many of the same settings that we have for our overall clouds in the sky and our cloud layers. We have a lighting and effects tab where we can adjust whether or not we'd like to cast shadows, internal shadows, and those, of course, will take effect on our meta cloud. We also have our cloud settings tab, which is more specific to our meta clouds, where we can adjust the God ray intensity. So how much light we're actually going to be blocking with this cloud. So once this is actually in the ray, and we have just some meta clouds in the scene, or they're blended, what we can do is use our God ray intensity to increase the effect that we see and the amount of rays that we see. We also have our detailed settings, roughness, scaling, which is all pretty much exactly the same as our other settings, except these are for our meta clouds. We could also set a density production. We could use a function to control this. Currently, right now, it's not being controlled by a function at all. It's just being controlled by our basic meta cloud layer, volumetric material. If I go to edit function, we can take a look, and we see that there are no nodes as part of the creation of that. But we can, of course, add nodes and use the function editor for density, and that way we can customize these meta clouds a little bit more. And one thing to definitely keep in mind is that meta clouds will only work within a spectral atmosphere. So you cannot use them in some of the other models. If we take a look at our different models, we have our spectral model, volumetric, and standard. It will only work in the standard model. If I switch this to volumetric, the cloud disappears along with the effects that we see on the sky. But more importantly, we're looking at the cloud and the fact that it has disappeared because it only works with our spectral model. But that's a good thing because we can blend our layers for our clouds and our meta clouds together quite nicely because they're all built pretty much on the same system. Meta clouds are also another nice way to enhance an animation. We could have some of the built-in effects that we have with under the cloud tab, velocity, rate of change, direction, and all these cloud animation tools. But with a meta cloud, we can physically move it, which is a lot easier to do with a meta cloud than it is with a layer. So what we could do is have a little bit of variation in there where we could have some meta clouds moving, even changing their sphere shapes as well, although a little more detailed, and that'll take a little bit longer if you want to move individual spheres. But it gives us a good idea where we can rotate the cloud a little and even have this material animate to sort of match up with what we have in our other cloud layers. And another thing to keep in mind too with metaclouds is that they are also affected by our global lighting adjustments. So just like the rest of the sky, we can adjust the brightness, and the metacloud will enhance its brightness as well, or decrease, and we can make it a little bit darker. So that is tied hand in hand together, so we can use these tools to edit them both equally, which is a very good thing, because if we want to just match up our cloud or metacloud to our other clouds so that the colors look right and all that, once we have that matched, we can go in here and play around with these global lighting settings and not worry about offsetting the metacloud from the layered cloud so that it looks similar, and we don't have to worry about that.